Hey everyone, it's Frodan here to show you how to navigate through 13.16 B patch, one of the most balanced patches we've ever seen in TFT. There's a ton of different ways that you can approach this patch depending on what legend you pick and what comps you like. So let me break down what makes all these comps tick, and then you can choose for yourself what you want to climb with. Aphelios is the strongest AD carry to play around currently, and there's two main variations. One is the Freljord and Deadeyes, and the other is to focus on Bastions. The most important thing in general with Aphelios is getting attack speed, which is why so many people care about things like Rage Blade for Aphelios, because it helps ramp them out throughout the course of a fight. So the general rule is the better your frontline is, the better Aphelios will perform. In a lot of cases, you could play around with the number of Deadeyes that you end up playing with. A lot of times people, when they play the Freljord version, like to go for 4 Deadeye. Let's say instead of this Heimerdinger, you hit a Akshan 3. But in a lot of cases, late game, you actually end up dropping things like the Akshan and even the Ashe and just start playing for really good units. So you end up playing, say, the Heimerdinger here, and then you end up going for like a Senna in the late game. Then you have an opportunity to drop, say, Lissandra and add in a Rise. And this is how you usually take a comp over the top when you're playing things like Aphelios or Aphelios. I do want to emphasize that it's important to roll at 7, even if you don't really want to. And that's because you're going to be trying to stabilize your board state around a lot of 2 and 3 costs. And if you're really lucky, you might even hit things like Aphelios 2 or Sejuani 2. Remember, at 7, you don't need a 2-star all your 4 costs. Even having just a couple of pairs is okay. If you just have like 1 copy of Aphelios, you don't have to roll too much more. The cases where I would roll at level 7 for 4 costs 2-star is if I'm holding multiple of them. Like, let's say if I have Aphelios pair, Sejuani pair, and an Urgot pair, then definitely at that point you can consider rolling. Otherwise, try to go to level 8 because the comp is expensive and you do want to get things online. In terms of the combat augments you're looking for, things like social distancing and anything that boosts your power, like know your enemy or anything related to that, is really, really strong. Glacial Breed does give you that attack speed and gives you things like the early Ashe to start playing around. If you do end up picking things like Glacial Breeze, don't drop Failure late game. And Cut Above is really good. Deathblade is one of the best items on Aphelios to complement the Rage Blade, plus it farms gold so you can hit your things more likely. Aphelios can pretty much use any legend. You can justify like Ezreal and Ornn so you can get extra items that combo really well with these champions. And also just play like Poro so they have more chances of hitting a lot of the really powerful augments that we mentioned. The other main legend that really likes to play Aphelios strategies is Vladimir. I actually covered this in my most recent Vladimir guide if you want it more in-depth in terms of how you actually approach this. The general concept is that Transfusion and Ascension are really good to both have a really strong frontline and scale your composition. A lot of times when you're playing this kind of style, you actually don't really care that much about Deadeye. You purely want to ramp Aphelios to be basically a 1v9 machine, and these units with Bastions and even things like this Gwen is really good at stalling out for the first half of that fight. Make sure you take things like +1 Bastion or Morning Light, which is really good, heals all your front line, and you're able to play around like a really unkillable Shen plus a scaling Aphelios. A lot of people actually think that in the B patch that because of the nerf to Transfusion that Aphelios is less viable with the Transfusion strategy, but it actually still is doing pretty well in some of the in-house scrims leading up to the end of set tournaments. So don't listen to your friends saying like, oh, they nerfed it, does that mean it's unplayable? No, it's actually still pretty decent. In terms of positioning Aphelios, you pretty much want to just make sure that he is the safest. So if you know that your opponent is playing some carries that want to jump backline or even a Jarvan, try to make sure that Aphelios is away from the clump. So in late game situations, you might do something like this. So that way, if Jarvan's like in the center, he'll likely go to the bottom left instead. In terms of the Bastion, just make sure that if you're ever playing something like Taric and Shen with Aphelios, that you always have Taric and Shen next to each other so they can help protect and shield each other. And then having things like Gwen and Aphelios next to each other, or this ends up being like Senna, you can just put her in the back corner, but try to make sure you align things so you can snipe some really important units early on. If you're looking for like Ornn item recommendations, let's say instead of this, Bramble Declaw, you can just play like Eternal Winter or Anima Visage. Like these are totally fine items to play on units like Sejuani. And Sniper's Focus is actually one of the strongest Ornn items to play, and you can probably get it from some of these portals. You're talking about Ornn's Forge or Hall of the Nine. You might be able to still have a really strong Aphelios setup like this. I wouldn't really recommend anything else though. I don't think like Obsidian Cleaver does enough. In fact, I'd probably just put Obsidian Cleaver on somebody else like Ashe or somebody else to really shred for Aphelios. Also, I didn't really say this before, but you can totally just also itemize Shen. Let's say you hit Shen 2 and you don't hit Sejuani. Don't put items on the Sejuani 1 if you have a Shen 2, and just have Shen be your main tank. In terms of the build-up, there's 2 really common item holders that really try to bridge their way into Aphelios. The first is Jhin with Ionia because he's just a Deadeye, so you could give him things like the Rage Blade and the Death Blade immediately. From here, you would add Warwick so you can get the Challenger and the Juggernaut so you can supplant your front line. And then on level 6, you can add a Lissandra here here to get that Aphelios tech in. Then at level 7, ideally, you can even just play Sejuani and have this core units. A lot of times, if you're on level 7 and you have like 2-star of almost all this board, but like a Sejuani 1, I think a lot of people feel like they have to roll more, hit the Aphelios, and then like sell Jhin and sell Irelia and sell Set, and then play like 1-star Urgot, 1-star Aphelios, and then maybe they hit like a Rek'Sai. But it's like all 1-star, and then they're wondering why they're losing on stage 4. Try not to replace those 2-star units with 1-stars. The other option to play around for early game is Samir and Cassiopeia and Swain for Noxus. Samir and Noxus is actually really cheap tempo in ways that you can get kind of snowballing early. So if you have Samira hold these AD items, you have a lot of options here. You could just play like another frontline unit like Terex. You can support the Swain. Bridges to say Soraka. So you have the Targon and the Invokers. From here, you can add a different Bastion unit. So you can just say tech in a Cassidon. And you can just play kind of this core and have Samira being scaled this way. But you also do want to think about things like challengers as well, so you can have that extra attack speed for Samira. So sometimes you end up playing things like Warwick. Maybe instead of Cassiopeia, you find a Darius, so you have the Juggernaut. At 7, you finally find something like Aphelios or even Akshan. Because you find Aphelios, you need to cut Samira and Darius, so you can just play the Lysandra and the Ashe. And instead of Warwick, you go for another Bastion. Let's say you find a 1-star Shen. And you can actually play something like this for a little bit of time as you continue to transition and find the proper units like Sejuani and the others. Zeri is the other Rageblade AD carry holder, so the priority is actually going to be quite similar. You're going to be looking for a lot of attack speed items like Rageblade. I will say that Zeri is actually not even that bad holder of RFC as well. So if you have like a lot of bows and you just realize that you have too many of them, just slam the RFC on Zeri as well. Zeri's best Zon mods are Virulent BioWare or going for a robotic arm. Both those Zon mods are her best in slot basically, but you can also justify like Shimmer and Adaptive if you have a good enough support DPS other places. Usually when you're rolling at 7 for Zeri and you're trying to play like say the 3 Freljord version with it, unlike Aphelios, your front line's a lot weaker unless you're hitting things like the Sejuani, the Urgot, and probably going to be playing things like Vi 2 in the meantime until you find Scion. But let's say you have Sedge 1, Urgot 1, and like Vi 2, you can recognize that your front line is going to be a little bit weaker. And so Zeri really wants to make sure that your front line is also good so you can scale her Rageblade. If you end up playing Zeri, combat augments are really, really important. So you want really strong damage amplification to things like Know Your Enemy, Gifts of the Fallen, tons of stats. Also, component-driven augments are pretty good as well, especially things like you have my sword and you have my bow, so you can get really good items onto Zeri. As you can see, you pretty much want as many bows and swords as you can get, and even on Urgot could use a bunch of bow and sword items. The other items that you could recommend on Zeri is if you're playing 2 gunner, you want to have Death Blade so that you have the raw flat AD for you to melt everything. But if you're playing 4 gunner of any kind, let's say you're playing like Piltover plus 4 Gone 4 Zon, you're able to get away with not having Death Blade and instead prioritize things like Last Whisper because you don't have the Freljord for the armor sundering. Giant Slayer is also pretty big right now because it helps Zeri amplify her damage against a lot of tanks and makes you can pierce through. Guardbreaker is also a nice replacement as well for her. Positioning wise, it's kind of similar to Aphelios. You just want to make sure to protect Zeri as long as you can, but don't make it too easy for your opponent to punish you with AoE clump. And then you also have Senna like usually on the opposite side, so you can aim and hit the entire board. In specifically like the Zeri boards that don't have a lot of frontline, I actually think that currently triple repair on Apex turret is actually kind of underrated. With the rework to Repair-O-Matic, now when they have more counts of the repair, you get more resistances. So this ends up being really, really powerful against a lot of the Luxes, and if you see a Darius in the lobby, those high burst compositions are going to struggle a little bit more if you put the Repair-O-Matic in the way. In terms of positioning, if you do end up having something like Apex turret, you can have Apex turret plus a tank and just spread it out. You can keep the Apex turret in front of Zeri, so that way when they kill the Apex turret, they focus on your main tank like Sejuani. And then after, by the time they cut through Sejuani, the Apex turret revives and it's another tank that gets in the way. Urgot being in the corner helps him jump past whatever he's targeting and maybe start aiming at the backline corner carry for your opponent. And then you can always just like move Ashe somewhere in between here so that she can finesse her way through to ice arrow the backline. The legend I recommend to play around Zeri is either Ezreal or Ornn because you just want to have a lot of items. You're itemizing 3 units. The best Ornn item for Zeri is Sniper's Focus, although you could probably justify Obsidian Cleaver as well. Would not recommend Gold Collector just because she already does execute, so it's not necessarily as effective. And then the usual stuff like, you know, Eternal Winter and the Anima Visage, as well as Hull Crusher. These are all like pretty reasonable items to play, especially if you get up a Capricious Forge. Capricious Forge is actually really good in this comp if you put it on a Sign or an Urgot for those reasons. If you get something like Eternal Winter and Anima Visage in tandem, it's actually really oppressive for other opponents' attack speed compositions to get online. Don't forget about things like Death Defiance on Urgot, it's also pretty good. Just want to touch really quick on the other variations of Zeri that you might see because she's quite versatile. You can play her with the Piltover or the 4 Gunner 4 Zon variations. This is usually played from a loose streak and you cash out and you try to play around the 3 Piltover featuring Jace. But you do have the option option of cutting the Piltover if it's not really a powerful T-Hex. Let's say you cash out a little bit early and you have like, 8 to 12 stacks. You can cut Vi and you can cut Jace, and then you can just play standard from here. In this spot, for example, you can just play like Sign and a Heimerdinger and just kind of resume as usual. And then eventually you would cut things even like the Jinx and the Echo and just play higher quality units like Rise and the Aatrox. Usually the main condition is if you just get a Piltover Heart as your augment or something that gives you +1 Piltover if you're playing Earth. So definitely be on the lookout for Piltover as a really powerful start. The last variation of Zeri that is really common is 6 Zon Zeri. This current patch, even though they nerfed the 6 Zon interaction with Jarvan, he's still a really good holder of unstable chem tank. So when he dives in, he's going to explode and AoE all the entire backline. After the 13.16 B patch, 4 Gunner is really powerful in particular because they buffed the straight up damage of it. You don't really have to play things like the Freljord option, and you can just play Zeri with Last Whisper and then go for 4 Gunner instead. So the augments that you'd probably pick in this spot are like Zon related augments or just something generic combat wise again. And the one thing I want to say in final note is that 6 Gunner is very powerful, but you do have to play Tristana. So ideally you get 2 Gunner emblems, but that's really, really hard to secure. Probably only do it on portals like Placidium Library or other ways to get extra tomes. The build up for Zeri is actually quite similar to Aphelios, but I'm going to show you one other variation where you can just play around early Gunners through like Tristana and Jinx. Because you want to look at your early Zon mod as fast as possible to see if it's a really good mod for Zeri, you end up checking with Warwick really often. If you end up playing Warwick, the best synergy to activate is Juggernaut, so that way you have actual tankiness with damage reduction. From here, you could totally add like any challenger unit that you want, maybe even just like frontline support like an Irelia on 5. And since you have Ionia anyways, you might as well just go for it. So you add like a Jhin here, and all of a sudden you're playing like Jhin, Gunners, Ionia. One thing that's really interesting, as you might notice, is, well, this is what we're opening with. Why not even just think about pivoting into a challenger line? And that's what makes it really fascinating, is that you totally could. Let's say you're in a spot where you're playing like Tristana and you have like Rageblade, Last Whisper, trying to Langle Zeri, and then you just get hit with like a random Kalista 2. You can have Kalista hold stuff like this. And then eventually when you hit something like Yasuo can come in and you can start building around Yasuo with Last Whisper and a Edge of Night. So I end up talking about a different comp almost in the build up, but I hope you get to see about what makes it really flexible, because in reality, you can also just kind of play this and then you just replace Kalista Yasuo with Zeri and Jinx like so. And then on 7, you hit an Urgot and all of a sudden you're back into the 4 Zon with even a Deadeye with the Jhin. There's another variation that people are experimenting with just double Rageblade Zeri, kind of having the ability to flex between Zeri and Aphelios. That's also viable as well, so give it a try. If you do end up going double Rageblade on Zeri, remember you need Gunner or a lot of combat augments to make up for her lack of DPS because she has so much attack speed. Lux has become one of the best carries in the patch because they basically changed her animation so she can turn around on her next target very quickly. This is a huge DPS buff and make sure that she's able to cleanly finish fights. The most common way to play Lux is to play around Sorcerer as her main vertical alongside 3 Demacia featuring Jarvan and Sona. In this kind of setup, the most important thing to prioritize is MR Shred and getting your AP items. The AP items is usually 1 mana item plus 1 AP item, usually Jewel Gauntlet. Jewel Gauntlet is a lot better than things like Death Cap and Archangel Staff, mainly because you have a lot of flat AP already from the 6 sorcerers. So you can see you get 80 AP already, which is already like a Death Cap. You want to have 2 Death Caps? No, you'd rather actually convert off of it with damage amplification through Giant Slayer Guardbreaker or going for big burst like Jewel Gauntlet. In terms of positioning, it's actually pretty straightforward. You actually kind of want to always keep the front line kind of close to each other. Tarek, remember, gives adjacent shielding to things like Swain, but you want to keep your spark generally centered because it maximizes the radius that you're able to hit a bunch of AP champions. In terms of positioning, you generally want to have Tarek or Swain in the center. Whoever's holding the spark basically stays in the center. Jarvan kind of moves according to where you want him to leap into the back line. And you want to make sure that whoever is holding the spark, that Lux is within range of. Sometimes you end up doing weird things like, okay, I want like Tarek and Swain here because maybe they have like a Cassante or something you want to kick. Don't ever have Swain and like your Lux or your Vel'Koz be too far away from the spark. Always make sure you're getting within that shred range. Your win condition for this composition is usually hitting Ahri and giving her items, but there's also other backup options that you can have with like Lux 2 and Vel'Koz 3. Vel'Koz 3 is actually quite an underrated carry currently, ever since they fixed the animation bug and buffed his base stats as a trade-off for multicasters being weaker. If you do end up hitting 3-star Vel'Koz, go for kind of like the mana item. It could be blue buff Shojin, Jewel Gauntlet, and Gunblade. You could also go for like a Giant Slayer Guardbreaker here in this spot as well. Remember that Sona's attack speed actually matters, especially if you end up playing things like Shojin instead of the blue buff, because you just can't get that many tiers. Sona buffing the attack speed means that Vel'Koz and Lux or whoever else is much more likely to cast. In terms of augments that you really want, the usual Sorcerer +1, because that way you can get all of it at level 7 is really important. Overcharge Mana Font is still one of the best mana sources that possibly can be given for sorcerers. And then Infusion is just basically like a other variation of Overcharge Mana Font, but slightly worse. The legend that's usually best with this is the things that help you give that +1. This is why Earth is really good, because you can get that Sorcerer +1. Many people believe actually that if you don't have like a Sorcerer Emblem or a Sorcerer Heart, you really shouldn't be playing Sorks as your main line. Because if so, then you probably will play another Lux variation that we'll cover, which is Lux Azir or Lux Demacia. Speaking of, Demacia Lux is actually quite good, and a lot of people think that this is a Garen comp, but it's now transformed to be much more of just like vertical Demacia, with Lux being your main damage dealer. In this spot, you end up playing things that give you flat AP like Archangel Staff and Death Cap instead of Jewel Gauntlet, because you don't have that much AP from the Sorcerer. In fact, you don't have any Sorcerer at all in this current setup in order to get that extra damage burst. So you give her this, and hopefully that she rolls things like Radiant Giant Slayer, Radiant Death Cap, so on and so forth. A lot of times with this item prio, you end up going for things like the Garen with BT and Titans, and then you end up having like Shojin as your first item or blue buff, and you put it on a different unit while you're trying to carry Garen. And then when you're rolling at 7 specifically, you're going for things like this Lux. So if I were to tweak one thing on my chalkboard here, instead of Vel'Koz 3, I would just say it's Lux 2 and Garen 3 as your win condition. And then you go to level 9 to add in legendaries, you know, like the usual stuff. You can have that Aatrox, and you can play Heimer, for example, get a little bit of shred, because there is no real inherent shred in Demacia. Don't forget, you can just put Ahri, and let's say you have like a Demacian emblem, and boom, you can just do something like this and have a really high chance of winning the game. In terms of augments, if you do end up going for the Demacia version, try to pick up things that just amplify the damage, like Petrified Shackles or Magic Wand, which just gives you straight up the burst with Lux. And then Cybernetic Bulk, because you're playing so many Radiant items that you get for free. So if you just put like 1 on Jarvan, you know, 1 on Sona, and then 2 on Garen's Lux, you just get like a bunch of value through the Demacia. So in terms of buildup of how we actually try to get there, in a lot of cases, we end up playing around Malzahar and Orianna a lot, because there are 2 sorcerers that can hold these items very easily. And so just whoever you 2-star, just end up giving things like the blue buff and the Jewel Gauntlet to whoever's 2-starred first. Because you're playing Malzahar, you really want to link into really easy front lines, so you can play like Kassadin and Cho'Gath for the Void. And then at level 5, you can hit the Taric to go for the Sorcerer Bastion. And this also means that if you hit Vel'Koz, you can replace things like the Cho'Gath to get the Force Orc. Swain is also a really good opener as well. In fact, you could even take out a lot of this and just say like the Force Orc starter could be like Swain. And this also, by the way, applies to the Noxus variation. Let's say you don't have Orianna, you just have like a single Malzahar pair, but you hit like the Cassio and the Samira. The best holder in spots like this is actually Cassio instead. You can go for like blue buff and Jewel Gauntlets, and then you can add an Invoker whenever you want. Let's say you play like a variation like this, and then you tech in things like the Taric for a little bit more frontline, and then Galio gets cut. You can add in the Vel'Koz here. You can add in Vel'Koz here at 6. You can totally play something like this, which is a little bit unusual, but actually quite good. One thing to note is that if you do have something like Sunfire Cape, you always want to put it where Cassio is, because Cassio with her Twin Fang deals bonus damage to people who are wounded, aka people that get tagged by the Sunfire Cape, and rack up a lot of damage this way. If you do manage to get like a Sorcerer Emblem of some kind, let's say Cassio's holding the Sorcerer, always try to get 6 Sorcerer as fast as you can, so you're able to get that big burst. This is because when you go for 6 Sorcerer, you go from 1 enemy to 2 enemies, you basically double that shock value. Finally, at 7, you can go ahead and cut things like the Noxus and hold on to things like the Demacia units if you're able to find the Jarvan at 7. A lot of times people end up playing like Garen or Galio in the front line in the meantime, and then playing around the Sona this way. If you do end up getting the +1 Sorcerer, you end up going for Sona a lot of the times. And instead of Galio, you could just play things like this Cassin, for example, if you're playing a Demacian emblem instead. And this is how you kind of thread between the 2 compositions, which is a lot of times it depends on if you have a +1 Sorcerer or +1 Demacia. A lot of times when you're playing the Demacia version, it's because you hit like really good frontline like Poppy 2, Maokai 2, and you have this like random Kale. You go for like a Galio, and then you end up playing like a backliner that complements this, like Soraka, and then you cut Maokai and you play like a Taric so that we can get like the Bastion. If you're able to hit that early Garen, you do want to go for 5 Demacia ASAP as well. So let's say you start off with Garen and you have like a +1 +1 Demacian emblem, and let's say you get a Demacia crest or you're playing Petricide Shackles. In this kind of spot, you can just go for a Demacian emblem on whoever, like Soraka, or you go for a Juggernauts in this spot to really complement Garen, and you go for like BT and Titans. The only thing about going for like the Juggernaut here, in my opinion, is that you don't have a really good holder of things like your Lux items. That's why I like to play around things like Cassio and that Invoker with the Taric, so that way you can get things like Blue Buff and Death Cap on Cassio and feel like you're actually outputting like a ton of damage here. A lot of good units to also play around with things like Teemo, because if you end up hitting like the Sona, you can just play Sona for a little bit. And at 7, you roll really hard so you can hit Garen 2 and ideally a single Lux, sell this Cassio and put these items onto Lux instead, and then you pay the Kale back in. Important note, try not to sell things like your Kales and your Poppies even if you're flexing around the traits a lot, because you do end up wanting to be able to Tekken 7 Demacia for those 4 rating items whenever you can. If you find Jarvan can go in here over Poppy, for example. Otherwise, you're just going to be stuck playing Poppy without a Demacian emblem, and your board's going to look something like this. The best unit you can add in at level 8 is usually an Aatrox, because it buffs your front line. Aatrox Darken gives a bunch of HP when he dies, and that synergizes really well with the resistances. You do end up doing that, try to have your Aatrox next to your Garen, so that way Garen gets those stats. And the Demacian emblem is best held on Aatrox in a spot like this. If you do feel like you're in a position to go for 9 Demacia, you do need 2 emblems. If you're able to do that, definitely go to 9. Just, you know, I don't know, play a Heimer, for example, get the Demacian emblem on him. 9 Demacia is very fearsome. Funnily enough, a lot of people ask about whether or not at level 9 Kale becomes relevant in 9 Demacia, and she does. So let's say you find like a random Rage Blade and RFC off Carousel, you can actually have Kale contribute back towards the comp, even though she's like a 2-star unit. The other variation of Lux that you can play is a Strategist Azir dual carry. This is really good if you're able to start off with like Lux items, but recognize that you don't actually have a good sorcerer opening because you don't have a sorcerer emblem, you don't have a Demacian emblem. Instead, you're just playing around like generic AP items and a good setup like this. If you do end up doing that, you can actually play like Garen as your early game item holder with things like this until you end up finding Nasus, and then play around a 3 Demacia core. You also really value Shred through things like Shiv on the Azir instead of a Spark, so that we can get 3 items onto your Nasus eventually. The last item here for Azir doesn't really matter. You can give him like Death Cap, you can give him like Giant Slayer instead, you can give him Archangel Staff. There's a lot of different things you can justify, but make sure that you have good Lux items, because in the end, as much as it's a comp that has dual carry, it's really about Lux in the first half and Azir in the second half. If you do end up playing this variation, I actually think that Vladimir is a really good legend for this because of transfusion value on your front line. And Too Healthy has recently got fixed in the B patch due to a big bug that was keeping it down. So Swain, Teemo, Talia gives you a bunch of HP. So as you can see, a lot of defensive augments are really good here. Transfusion, Too Healthy, Unified Resistance, even Cyber Bulk, if you're able to get to a lot of item spread, is really good. Jumping off of the point of Lux and how a lot of times Lux with Azir strategist is like a Lux composition, how do we make Azir really shine in this is largely dependent on how we're scaling up our composition. Azir is a person that takes over the second half of fights because he ramps up a lot of the damage, whether it's through things like Rage Blade, Shiv, Archangel Staff, etc. with the Shurima bonus. You have Lux take care of the first half and then Azir take care of the second half. In the composition like this, you want to try to get to level 8 as safe as possible, because hitting this version of the board is usually not good enough. You're actually looking to cut things like Teemo and Talia to eventually go for things like Shen and the Cassante. And this is a much more expensive version of the board. As you can see, it's like a ton of front lines, a lot of units, a lot of 4 and 5 costs. And so the finesse with this composition to try to play Azir is learning how to play a strong early and mid game, so that way you can get to level 8 with as strong of a board as possible. A strong level 8 is not all 1-star of this with Nasus 2. That's not a strong level 8. The most important thing about playing Azir is learning how to skip level 7. Skipping level 7 usually means that you have things like the Teemo and Talia at 2-star with, you know, a Swain 2 and potentially a Nasus 2, a Azir 1, Lux 1, Jarvan 1. But when you can get to 8, you cap out with the board so high just because you have so many high value units. And if you're able to somehow find a way to get to 9 or even have a +1 Demacian emblem, you can have things like this Heimerdinger, cut Garen, play Aatrox, and this is a board that should be able to win lobbies. So getting to level 8 safely also has 2 meanings. One usually means you're win streaking a lot early and therefore you are high tempo. You don't have to roll at 7. You can just skip rolling at 4-1 and trade a little bit of HP to go to 4-5. The other option is to play from behind if you're playing something like Vladimir and you get transfusion, so you can have a bunch of HP on your front line. That way Azir gets time to ramp up. If you want a little bit more tips on how to play Vlad, once again, check out the Vladimir guide that I had that outlines how to go into a comp like this if you're playing from behind. But playing from behind on level 7 with Azir is really tricky because the entire difficulty of it is rolling at 7 without giving up the ability to go to level 8. With positioning with Azir, you generally just want to keep him safe for the most part and on the same side as your tank, so that way they don't go through the weak side. If we went back to the previous board and showed, say, like this Garen, for example, a lot of times if you end up playing like Azir on the weaker side of your front line, people just get through and charge Azir. You want him to have to go through the Nasus first. And that's why Gunblade is like kind of important when you play like an Azir comp, because he heals the Nasus and keeps that super tank away from your carry. The other variation of Azir that we can talk about is vertical Shurima, which is something that people don't play that often unless they have like a really good setup with specifically like Shurima's Crest and Shurima's Legacy. This is usually the route that you take if you're playing Earth as your legend, because you get that +1 Shurima, so you have a lot of direction. In this kind of spot, because you don't have Lux as your secondary carry when you're playing around Azir, you really want to have things like that Rage Blade, so that way Azir becomes a hyper carry if the fight stalls long enough. Nasus items are even more crucial to have correct, and that's why you have things like a Shiv on this Akshan and not necessarily a Spark on a Nasus or a Shiv on Azir. This is because they are the stars of the show and you want them to ascend. 7 Shurima, by the way, is absolutely worth playing if you do find a way to get to it pretty safely. If you find an Aatrox, a lot of times you end up just playing 7 Shurima with whatever frontline you can hit. So instead of this Aatrox, you go for like Sejuani, for example, so you get the Bruiser synergy with Renekton. And this also means that whoever has the Shurima emblem could just be holding it as well. If there was one Shurima to cut when you have the +1, I usually go for Talia. She does have a little bit of extra CC, but I personally like having Cassio in case I ever hit something like a Rise or a Shen. So that way they have links to Invokers. I actually rearranged this so you can see like the core 6 units plus like other units you can play entirely with the Shurima emblem. Also, in these kinds of scenarios, you can totally 3-star Akshan and just give him random items to help secondary carries. So you can go like the Deathblade Runins. Don't worry too hard about it. Just give Akshan whatever DPS you can have so you can help support the team. If you do get up Ornn items, the best items for Azir, in my opinion, is probably something like a Zhonya's Hourglass, because it ends up preserving Azir a lot of HP and also draws aggression away from him to help him scale. And to bring Lux back into the fold, if you want to play around Lux with an Ord item, give her a Deathfire Grasp. It's definitely really, really powerful. Nasus scales really well with things like the Eternal Winter, Anima Visage, and Hole Crusher, the usual combo. In terms of like what you end up building, a lot of times you play around like the Malzahar, Orianna, and the Void combo to start things off. So that way you can have Malz and Orianna hold things like Shiv and Death Cap. Frontline items go on Kassadin and Cho'Gath. And then from here, you would probably just go for the usual stuff like the Kassadin and then add a 4th sorcerer like Vel'Koz. You would cut Cho in this spot and then try to add like Teemo. And then at level 7, you could just tech in like an Azir, for example. And if you hit Lux, you just replace this Orianna. And you could play this board for a little bit until you save enough to go to level 8, transition to the Lux Azir with the Nasus comes in here. You cut Kassadin and Jarvan comes in. This is also an entirely reasonable board to play for a little bit until you can get everything online. Cut 2 sorcerers, tech in Garen for the Demacia Juggernauts, and maybe replace with a Talia you finally find, and now you're back into the strategist line. If you do end up playing around a Shurima +1, a lot of times you play around the 3 Noxus and you give a Shurima emblem to say like this Swain. And in this kind of setup is largely around how strong is your front line. So you just give Swain like a defensive item, whether it's like Warmogs or Bramble or something like that. And you have Cassiopeia hold like a lot of these AP items. At 5, you can add a little bit more frontline. Let's say the Taric here to help support. At 6, you can add in Teemo, so a little bit extra damage and burst through Multicaster and Strategist. Let's say you find the Darius instead of this Samira, so you can get a little bit of the bridge to the Juggernaut. Let's say you find the Nasus instead. I will say that 5 Shurima does feel a lot weaker in the mid game, so if you do end up playing around like early Akshan, for example, instead, just be careful. 5 Shurima sometimes is really disappointing because then you end up cutting a lot of units for things like this, and you realize that unless you have like a Nasus, your frontline is not very good. Let's say in this kind of scenario, you're playing like Renekton. Sometimes you end up playing a variation like this, but you're probably gonna have to roll a lot on 7 so you can hit things like the Nasus, and eventually you cut things like the Darius so you can play the Talia back in. And at 7, you end up playing around things like Sejuani Ashe, and you have like 5 Shurima, and this is actually a really common way that you can kind of set things up until you have like the Azir and everything else ready to go. Counter is still a pretty solid comp to play right now, especially when you're win streaking and ahead. This is because Yasuo is actually a much more reliable carry right now since they buffed a lot of his base damage for Last Breath. And this is because they took away the range extension with the Whirlwind. So if you build RFC on Yasuo, he no longer goes to 4 hexes, which is actually kind of sad. Personally, I really like that interaction. I thought it was really cool, but it created a lot of frustrating moments where players were just like having Yasuo jump on backliners randomly and then just like assassinate everything. But because they buffed the base damage of it, you can actually just build a lot of good 80 items like Runins, Deathblade, Infinity Edge, Last Whisper, You can get a lot of mileage currently off of Yasuo, just assassinating backline. The other carry that people are playing around a lot is Kalista right now. Kalista is really, really strong. So I wrote down in my priority list that you can go for Kai'Sa and Yasuo items as your number 2. But you can also see that there's like a way for Jewel Gauntlet and these bonus damage like Guard Breaker and Giant Slayer to kind of bridge off of each other. And you can play around Kai'Sa or Kalista. Usually a differential maker is, let's say you had this extra sword and you, instead of going for GS and Guard Breaker, you go for Shojin, and therefore you can play around Kai'Sa instead. And so what makes challengers really interesting is just all different ways you can lean into the win condition, because you can play variations of Kalista, Kai'Sa, Yasuo, or Gwen. In terms of positioning, you usually want things like Aatrox to be buffing Yasuo or Shen, so you can have it like in this position specifically. Also, if Yasuo's getting popped up and his Edge of Night is proccing too early in the fight, you can just always move him back here. Kalista generally wants to be on the safer side and trying to take down things like their most important tank. And then Kai'Sa, because she dashes to safety, usually goes into the center. Nice little note here is that sometimes you can have Kalista and Samira double up, so that way you can shred a single tank together for this Yasuo. A lot of times, Heimerdinger can also just be the best legendary you can play. If you're thinking about Challenger Emblem, Heimerdinger is definitely one of the top because its attack speed translates to the turret. Remember that if your turret casts a lot, you often just want to stack them with straight up damage, so like burn, shrink is really good. Although I'm still a big fan of 111. If you hit him early enough, you get enough gold rolling and also a little bit of execution damage. Other really good holders of the Challenger Emblem are Bel'Veth and Aatrox, and even things like this Rise can be potentially really good as well. Definitely experiment and have fun with it. And if you want more information on who are the best holders of each Challenger Emblem, check out my Earth guide, which breaks down all the best item holders as win conditions. In terms of augments, things like +1 Challenger Crest is obviously really good, so you can squeeze it all in very efficiently and not even have to run things like the Samira. Also, social distancing in general, or anything that amplifies your combat strength, is really good because you have so much attack speed, so you'll amplify that damage with flat stats. And also want to give a shout out to things like Buried Treasures, Portable Forge, other item-based augments. Best Ornn item that you can really play around that's generic is things like Triforce, because Triforce can go on like Yasuo or Kai'Sa or Kalista. But you want to specialize, you can put things like this Death Defiance on Yasuo. Believe it or not, Sniper's Focus is actually quite good on Kalista because it just gives her that bonus damage and amplifies her spears. And that also applies to Kai'Sa as well, since she tends to dash really far away. A lot of people think that DFG might be good on Kai'Sa, but I wouldn't really recommend it because Kai'Sa spreads her damage out a lot, and a lot of times with Deathfire Grasp, you're trying to nuke a specific tank. In terms of build-up, this is one of the most common build-ups we've seen pretty much all set, which is around a Challenger and Ionia core. So you can play like Samira, Kalista, Warwick, Irelia. Or if you have Set and Jhin, you can just play around this as well. The nice thing about starting off with the Jhin core is that you can pretty much put all your items on Jhin. You can do things like Shojin, JG, Giant Slayer on Jhin. And it looks really weird because Jhin is not traditionally an AP champion, but because Jhin is like a sellable unit for the moment you hit things like Yasuo, that does not really matter. At 5, you can just add in another Deadeye if you're playing around that Jhin. You can go like Ashe, for example, and then support your frontline with a Juggernaut champion. So you can go for like Darius, for example, or Warwick. If you do end up hitting Warwick, definitely feel free to replace things like Ashe for a 4th Challenger if you hit Kalista. And you can move items onto Kalista by probably replacing this Jhin a lot of times. You can go for like another 1-star Jhin while playing this on 6. At level 7, you pretty much just replace Jhin 1-to-1 with the Yasuo, and then you just play the Kai'Sa, and then you are done. A lot of times you play Set 2 to hold a lot of defensive items. Let's go with like Bramble and Sunfire, for example. You want Set 2 until you hit Shen 2. I don't think it's necessarily worth playing a Shen 1. Another really interesting spot you could do to support things like your frontline is put Juggernaut Emblem on Yasuo if you're playing, say a Bando Cafeteria or some other portal. If you do get dropped like random things that like aren't Challenger Crest, you could also use things like Juggernaut Emblem. And then in this case, you would play around Nasus. And this actually ended up being a pretty solid composition to land like firmly in the top 2, top 3. Another variation that people have forgotten about is that you can just play 6 Ionia. Usually when you play 6 Ionia, it's because you have things like an Ionia emblem that you really want to play around. If you do end up playing around Ionia a lot, this is going to bridge back into something that we talked about previously in a different video, but Ionia Aphelios is actually really, really good. In this case, you're most likely be cutting something like Karma, so that way you have enough balance for your backline and frontline. You don't really want to sacrifice too much of your frontline in scenarios like this. I think comps like this that play around like Aphelios Yasuo or like Yasuo Kai'Sa and have it lean directly into powerful traits like Ionia is best with long distance pals. If you're end up playing a spot like this, you try to go, instead of for Kai'Sa items, maybe in this kind of spot, if you do end up playing for it, maybe try to play for things like Last Whisper and Deathblade on Aphelios. This way you can get the armor shred, and then Yasuo Aphelios can scale really well. This variation is pretty high roll though, so usually you end up playing it only if you're in like a very econ rich portal, or you get something guaranteed like the Dreaming Pool. But this variation can actually still do a lot of work. And if you do end up not playing around the Ionia emblem and you just want to play around Ionia anyways because you hit everything, you can just totally like have Ahri hold extra items and maybe just splash in a different legendary like in Aatrox, for example, to make your front line really, really strong. Or you could go for a Heimerdinger like usual. I think a lot of people also have kind of forgotten that Bel'Veth is actually a really good Ionia emblem as well. Even though she got nerfed, she's still very, very strong if you can build around her. In this spot, I think you still want to give her things like Rage Blade to scale and probably an Edge of Night. RFC is also very much good too. Another variation that you can also play is if you 3-star Karma, you can totally just give her the Ari items. You can give her like blue buff and JG. In this setup, if you end up playing around Karma 3, you end up needing things like blue buff so she can cast more often. This is compared to the 6 invokers that gives her so much mana that you don't need blue buff. If you're playing 6 Ionia instead, you can play around Karma 3 carry. Last but certainly not least, we have Gwen and Callista Shadow Isles flex. Gwen and Callista is a really powerful dual carry that you can link together with all kinds of openings and items. A lot of times people really like to play around it if they get an Ancient Archives into things like a Shadow Isle emblem, or you're playing around portals that give you a lot of emblem direction, like a Placidium Library, for example. The 4 core units are here on the right, which is Maokai, Gwen, Callista, and Senna. And you just basically build around any one of their adjacent traits. So Maokai's a Bastion, Gwen's a Slayer, Callista's a Challenger, and Senna is a Gunner. You don't actually really play around Gunner really often when you play around Senna. It's usually just the fact that she's a really powerful late game champion. So if you have like a Bastion, you could play like 4 Bastion Shadow Isles or even 6 Bastion Callista instead of Aphelios. You have like that as your possibility while you dual carry Gwen, Callista, and eventually hit Senna. If you hit Challengers, you're going for like a vertical Challenger setup. If you hit a Shadow Isle emblem, you can go for 6 Shadow Isles. Usually put this emblem on like a Shen, a Yasuo, a Kaisa. You can also just go with legendaries, right? Aatrox is a Slayer that links with Gwen, and Heimerdinger is just OP, so you can always play Heimer. The reason why Viego doesn't really go into a lot of these 4 Shadow Isle setups is because 1, Rogue is not very reliable of a trait, and 2, Viego's not really that strong of a unit, especially in late game. But he's a good item holder, so if you're in a situation where you need someone to hold Gwen items, well, guess what? Just put all these stuff on Viego instead until you get Gwen. So these are your flex options that you're really looking at. The most important thing to consider is that with Callista, in these kinds of setups, actually really does want Rage Blade. I actually think it's more correct, instead of saying dual carry items, you want to say like Rage Blade plus like other stuff, because Rage Blade is really important for Callista to anchor your composition, and you do want to chase her for 3-star. The other bonus damage items you want are things like Giant Slayer, Guard Breaker. You can also go for things like Jewel Gauntlet instead of the Guard Breaker, for example, and get a lot of value off of it. This is partially why other augments like Magic Wand and Idealism can make sense, because you dual carry and get like really good damage amp, and you can have it both on Gwen and Callista, for example. If I were to rank all of them, I would say that 6 Shadow Isles is the best, followed by vertical Challengers, followed by Bastions. Because the thing is, if you end up playing the Bastion oriented setup and you have something like this, you might as well just play the Aphelios. I think it's much more consistent. But, you know, part of the fun thing about TFT is you kind of combine a lot of the lines that we talked about, and how sometimes you're playing this Bastion setup and then you play Callista. Sometimes you play and you play Aphelios instead. Sometimes you're just playing Heimerdinger and you don't have either Callista or Aphelios. Sometimes when you're playing Challengers instead as well, you end up carrying Kaisa and Callista and you don't really have Gwen. What really matters the most is that you have emblem direction, you know what you're building around, and you go for some kind of big vertical to help get a lot of power or a strong 5 cost. For the sake of making sure that we can talk about one tree instead of showing you every possibility you could play, let's just take the 6 Shadow Isles, for example, of how you want to position things like Gwen and Callista. You always want Callista and Gwen to be on the same side behind the tank, so that way Gwen and Callista can nuke the carry and the tank together. In some situations, if you're playing like somehow finding a way to like have Yasuo items as well, let's say you have like a second Shadow Isles emblem on him for some reason, like this, you cut Viego, and now all of a sudden you're giving Yasuo like damage items or whatever, then you also want Yasuo on the same side. And it's usually on the opposite corner, although sometimes you can even do something like this if you really want to concentrate one power on one side, but I wouldn't recommend that. If you're playing the Kaisa variation and you're not playing as many Shadow Isles, let's say you have 2 less Shadow Isle emblems and you don't have this Aatrox and you want to play around the Challengers instead, just put Kaisa in the bottom center here. And if you're playing the Bastion variation with a bunch of Targon and support, that way you're playing things like the Soraka and the Taric, and then you have like a +1 emblem of some kind. Bastion can be going here onto Gwen instead, and you can just kind of put them all in the same row. The Taric still goes between the Shen and the Maokai, but you do have a little bit more flexibility with how you go for the back line. A lot of times you end up using Soraka to like intercept their Zephyr, so that way she doesn't get hit by the corner unit, or you just have her clump away from the board, so that way you have like Jarvan open, jump towards the bottom left here. Ornn can be used in a couple different ways. The first is Sniper's Focus Callista, just get her a little more range and bonus damage. But there's also the Trickster's Glass Callista, both in the Challengers and the Shadow Isle variations. That is really good because it doubles up the Callistas and therefore you get the spear stacking onto each other and rend quicker. Deathfire Grass is actually quite a good item for Gwen because she's trying to get past her first target and maybe waltz her way to the back line. So you can definitely consider that for her as well. A lot of times in the early game, you're basically playing around this core. If you have a Shadow Isles +1, you put it on Poppy, for example. If you don't have a Shadow Isles emblem, just play like a standard like challenger board. You have like Callista and Maokai and Irelia. And then you can start to add in more bastions like that Poppy, or you can go into Cassidon. In general, this comp's going to lack a little bit of extra damage though. So you do want to make sure to itemize Callista as best you can. I also want to give a shout out to some really powerful items that can combine with Callista like Gambler's Blade or Goldmancer. These are also some powerful Shimmer Scale items that you can have on Callista so you can rack that gold up early. When playing Callista, you do want to get to 4 challengers as fast as you can. So you hit that Warwick and then you can tech in a Samira finally. If you do end up playing around a challenger oriented start, you're not really playing around Maokai nearly as much. Maokai is specifically good when you have Bastion and Shadow Isles, but with Callista, you actually don't need Shadow Isles active very often. If you do lean into like a tempo-oriented challenger start, you want to kind of play around these core units instead, plus Ionia and Juggernaut. On this spot, you would go for Set here. And then for Ionia on 6, you could either go for something like Jhin or Karma. We'll just go Jhin for now. Remember that Samira and Callista work really well together because even though Callista is scaling off of AP, she does a lot of physical damage as well. So Samira reduces that armor. A different variation that plays around Viego is to play around the early Rogue plus like cheap units like Maokai and Poppy, and you could play like Viego, Zed, Poppy, Maokai. Viego's the item holder for your first 3 items, and then anything left over goes to the Zed. This is because it also bridges pretty nicely into say like a Callista, and then instead of Poppy you play Irelia. As you notice, you're 2 out of 3 Ionia, so you might as well just go for the Set at this point. And this is a pretty stable level 6 board that you can play as well. Even though you're 3 out of 2 Shadow Isles, it's actually totally fine. You can also just bench Maokai, for example, and just play like a Warwick and just play 3 challengers. If you do find a Gwen, there is another variation that you can play that involves Slayers. So you can go for like a Slayer emblem, for example, and just put it on a different unit and try to go for 4 to 5 Slayers. But I generally would advise against this kind of line because I feel like I haven't seen many people have success with it, and it's actually really hard to pull off. The only time I've seen vertical Slayers actually do well is if you find a way to get like an unkillable Zed. Yes, Zed is still in the meta, but it's not really that common. It's kind of like B tier. From here, you would replace Zed and the Slayers instead with this Shen. And if you can find Yasuo to replace the Warwick and tech the Maokai back in, which should let you drop sets. And now you have 4 Shadow Isles and 3 Challenger, 3 and 2 Bastion on 7. Now this is a situation where this is why like Viego's like not particularly strong. You are better off a lot of times dropping that extra Shadow Isle and instead playing like this Kaisa, or even just temporarily playing like Samira, just so that way you can have that 4 Challenger and lean into Callista. But again, play around whatever items that you can have because you ideally want to hit that dual carry setup. Typing it back into my chalkboard so you can remember that you do need dual carry. You can't just have Callista solo carry. As you can see, there's a ton of different ways they can play all these different lines and comps. Sometimes what you do is like slam Rage Blade and let Aphelios and Zeri and Callista kind of take over, maybe go into that Azir. And there's so many different things that you can do between those lines to min-max your edge. So the important thing is to pick what you're good at, lean into your strengths as a player, and let the game come to you naturally. Don't try to overforce it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any extra tips and recommendations, let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time.